All right, hi everyone. As Doug mentioned, I'm Manasi, and today I'll be talking about ModelDB. A little bit about myself. I am a sixth year PhD student. I should get out at some point soon. It's a moving target, you know. And I work on tools and systems for machine learning as well as visualization. And today I'll be talking about a particular system that we're currently developing and how it can help improve productivity when you're doing machine learning. So before I go further, I want to acknowledge all the people who worked on ModelDB. It's a pretty significant research effort. Two of the students, Weiwei and Shunadi, are up here. They're master's students. Harihar just graduated. And the faculty advisors are Sam, who's my thesis supervisor, and Matei, who you guys would know since you're here. All right, so suppose that you're a data scientist or an ML engineer, and you've been tasked with building a model to predict credit default. So this is the data you have. You know that there's Barack Obama. He's a politician, reasonable credit history, low risk of default. Lindsay Lohan, struggling artist, kind of poor credit history, likely to default. And then Warren Buffett is just off the charts, right? Like, he's never going to default. So this is the task that you are assigned. And you start writing code in Spark, right? I'm assuming people have sort of looked at Spark code. This is a very, very simple model you could build. You read in the data, you sub-select the columns you care about, you transform the data, and then you build a logistic regression. You train it, and then you find that the accuracy is like 62%. It's not bad, it's better than random. Sometimes it's hard to beat random, so we're doing good. But we can do better. So you start messing with it. You try different kinds of classifiers. You start putting in pre-processing steps. This is like, OK, the number of times you delayed a payment on your credit card. Then you bring a cleaned up version of the data set. You do a parameter sweep. It goes on. By the time you're at model 50, your code looks nothing like the way you started. You have a bunch of indexers. You have a bunch of UDFs, parameter sweeps. You know, everything is in there. So does this seem familiar to people, sort of? All right. So here's the $1 million question, or $50 question. I'm willing to bet $50 that no one in here keeps track of all their models. And when I say keep track, I mean what data sources did you use? What parameters did you use? Where are the results? Where does the model live? What algorithms did you use? And that's not unusual. All the data scientists and ML engineers we talked to said the same thing. Yeah, we wish we could, but not really. I don't do that. And if you think about it, this is a problem. And for a few reasons that I think will resonate with the people here. One is, if you don't have a record of experiments, you don't know if your colleague already did that. And I spent some time in the recent internship where I spent 2 weeks trying to recreate results that an ex-employee had already created, just because we didn't have enough data to reproduce that experiment. You also lose insights along the way. Every model teaches you something about the data. And most of us are not organized enough to keep little notes that say, OK, when I tried this, this happened. Of course, it's difficult to reproduce results, like I mentioned. And something that we're excited about is you cannot query or search for models. And you want to do things like, where's the logistic regression I built last week with this particular feature? So those kinds of queries are currently very hard or impossible to run. And finally, the thing I want to mention is collaboration. So these days, there are multi-person teams which are building these models. And the question becomes, how does someone review your model? Is it only the code that you wrote? But you also want to compare it to what were the other things you tried. Is this really the best that we can do? So that's why not having a system in place to track models is a bad thing. And that led us to the problem of model management. And everyone talks about model management in a different setting. So I want to spell out what we mean. When we say model management, we mean tracking, storing, and indexing all kinds of modeling artifacts so that you can reproduce the results, share them, query them, and analyze them. So that's what I'll be talking about in the rest of the talk, specifically focusing on this particular system we've built called ModelDB. And the system is open source. It's running if you set it up. You can find it at modeldb.ccel.mit.edu. That'll take you to a website, and then that links to the GitHub. And I'll talk more about the GitHub repo at the end. Cool. So this is ModelDB. And we think of it as an end-to-end model management system. So what do I mean by that? We mentioned that we want to be able to track the models that we're building. So we have an API to ingest models, metadata, anything else that's relevant. We have a way to store and version modeling artifacts. So this is another one of the requirements that we mentioned. And finally, we have rich capabilities to query this data to ensure reproducibility and make it easy to collaborate. So that's querying reproducibility plus. All right, let's switch to a quick demo so that you know what the system looks like if you try it out. All right, I'm gonna head over to here, and I hope that you guys can sort of see. Sorry, can you guys see that, or do we need to zoom in?
I would definitely zoom in and put it in.
There we go. Okay. I don't think that's helping.
Command plus. Yeah.
Thank you. It's hard to think when you're on stage. All right. So suppose that this is a simple model, which is exactly the same that I showed you before. You set up the Spark, context, things like that. You read in the data, read via a CSV. You are subselecting a bunch of columns. You're transforming it. You're building a logistic regression. You're doing the train test split. You're fitting it on the training data, and then you're testing it on the test data. So that's what you would do normally when you're not using ModelDB. So suppose that you do want to use ModelDB because it's awesome and you can track what you're doing. Let me show you what that looks like. You start off with importing a few libraries. You set up a ModelDB syncer. The syncer is the object that talks to the server. So what it's going to do is it's going to extract all the information relevant for every operation that you're doing, and it's going to store it in the ModelDB backend so then you can query it later. And if you notice, some of the calls are a little bit different. So the call for CSV, which reads in a CSV file, has changed to CSV sync, which means not only do the operation, but sync all the data to ModelDB. The transformation operation, similarly, has changed to transform sync. So what that's going to do is it's going to know that you decided to subselect a set of columns, and only those are going to be propagated downstream. And finally, let me point you to fit sync. So instead of calling fit on a data frame, you'll call fit sync. And instead of calling transform, you'll call transform sync. So that's what the API looks like, and that's how you would use ModelDB. So let me start running this in the background while I show you what the front end looks like. So I'm running the simple version, and I'm going to let that go. If it breaks, we'll see what to do. All right. So here's some data that has already been generated and put in ModelDB. Once you have run a few workflows with ModelDB, all that data is going into a database, which right now is a relational database because it makes querying much easier for us. And here's the first overview page that you will see when you go to the ModelDB front end. It's showing you all the projects that exist right now. There is, one of the projects is the IMDb data project. And you can see that it has 501 models. If you hover on these things, it'll show you what kind of models there are. We also provide high-level overviews, like what is the minimum RMSE, what's the minimum F1 score, and so on. So then you can drill down. If you click on any of these guys, you'll be taken to the overview page for that particular project. And what the overview chart is showing is a timeline of all the projects of all the models you have built so far. And for each one of these, we know what kind of model you built, what were the metrics. So the red ones are pipeline models. The blue ones are linear regression, and so on. We also support flexible querying, flexible charting of this data using Vega, if you're familiar with Vega. So let's do something interesting. Suppose that I wanted to look at how the depth of a GBDT impacts my accuracy. So what I can do is I can filter down to only those models that are of type GBDT regressor. That's going to limit the data points to the GBDT. And then I can say, OK, for RMSE, let me see how max depth affected my results. And I'm also going to group by max depth because it looks nicer when we do that. So now that's telling us that as your max depth increased, the RMSE also increased. So that's like a pretty simple visualization, but you had to jump through a lot of hoops usually to get to this point. The other thing we also support is for a given project, we show all the data in a tabular format as well, which is super helpful if you want to maybe group by the type of model that you're running. So this is going to group by, these are all the linear regressions, these are the random forests, and so on. We also support adding annotations to things. So right now, actually, let me back up. This is our page for a particular model. And in addition to the metadata about the model, we also provide this visualization of the pipeline that generated it. Since like every transform event is being logged to the database, we can reconstruct how you got to that particular model. And then if one of your coworkers is looking at your models, he or she can say, this looks good, kind of wonky, or I don't know, whatever they think about your model. So that's how we're supporting annotations and collaborations as well. All right, so to show you that this actually works, the model that I trained has finished training at this point. We see some particular metric. We can jump over here. So that project didn't exist in ModelDB when I started out. It will now exist. It's called demo, and it's getting a bunch of data. So it's telling me that there's one model, this was the min and max, and so on. So just to keep it interesting, I'm going to also run another model, which has some pre-processing in there. And then at the end of the talk, we can go back and see the models that were produced as a result of that. So right now, you can see that there's only one dot. But as you build more models, you'll find the timeline that we saw earlier. Cool? All right. So while that's running, I'm going to switch back to the slides and walk you through a couple of architectural details that we think are important. Right, so before I actually go there, a lot of people don't use Spark as the sole modeling environment. And so we also support Scikit-learn. So ModelDB can be used with Scikit-learn in the same exact way. This is the identical code written in Python. And if you were to use ModelDB with Scikit-learn, you would do the same thing. You would change the read CSV calls to read CSV sync. The train test split similarly. Fit becomes fit sync. And predict becomes predict sync. So I'm going through this because this is like a core part of using ModelDB. But I would like to illustrate that it involves very little changes to the workflow once you have the system going. All right. So let me touch upon some of the design decisions that we made. ModelDB adopts a modular architecture. And we have a few native libraries right now for spark.ml and scikit-learn. And these libraries talk to the ModelDB backend through a Thrift API. And the reason for using Thrift is, of course, we want to add other connectors to, say, R or Lua or whatever language you're interested in. And everything is stored in terms of events. So if you're familiar with web programming, it's sort of an event-driven architecture in some sense. There's a fit event, there's an annotation event, there's a transform event, and so on. Over on the right side, the front end then queries the server in order to do visualizations and things like that. So our key sort of design goals here were, first of all, support diverse languages and environments. Make minimal changes to the workflow. So if you imagine, you can easily build a visual interface where you can drag and drop various components of your ML pipeline, and then we can log them very easily. The thing is, no one does that. And so we worked really hard to write these APIs that were extension of existing APIs that would make ModelDB simple to use. We have also focused very much on a rich visual interface because we think that good visualization tools are sorely lacking in this space. And we want to support complex queries, which might be a little hazy right now, but I'll get to it in some of the ongoing work we have on ModelDB. So that was the architecture. Let me sort of recap the features so that you know what it does if you download it as of today. We're doing tracking through our logging messages. We're doing versioning sort of for free. So every time you run your code, we create a new experiment run, and whatever model comes out of it is a version of that model. So we know everything you do, essentially. There's reproducibility, there's comparison queries, and we enable collaboration. So these were sort of things we started with, and we are providing them to varying extents at this point. All right. So ModelDB has been used by a few early users at this point. They're grad students and a few large companies as well. And here are the few things they say about it. Of course, everyone would like to have ModelDB because things would be so much simpler if you had a model tracking system. People think that it will help a lot with reproducibility and collaboration. Someone used it for a research project, and then while writing the evaluation section, just queried it so that they could get all their graphs, which is pretty awesome. And then someone else said the visualizations were a treat for the eyes. So that's something we're really, really focusing on so that we can give sort of a beautiful experience as you're trying to do this tedious stuff. All right, let me touch briefly upon ongoing work. So as of now, ModelDB is really focused on gathering information about pipelines that you're building, metadata about the operations that you do, and so on. But it turns out that there are a variety of modeling artifacts that are produced. So there's base data, there's intermediates. So when you apply pre-processing, you have a new data frame. There are the models themselves. You also have these predictions that are being generated each time and currently are not easy to query. And then the metadata, like I mentioned. So it turns out that when you want to do debugging or you want to explain what's going on in a model to a third party, you want to run queries such as this. So how did the GBDTs do on customers who are married and are interested in gardening, right? So if you were to currently run that query, you would need to maybe query a bunch of base data, because is married is an attribute in your base data. But then you don't have an existing attribute for interested in gardening. It is something that you're learning as you build the model. And so ideally what you want to do is you want to query the intermediates that were produced. So somewhere you might be dumping out the data, or maybe it's just an intermediate state which is cached in memory. Once you have that, then you want to query the models and figure out which ones were GBDTs, because that's what you're trying to do. And then finally, you want to query the predictions to figure out how did this model do, because I've actually kept track of how it did. So if you look at the bottom, you're querying very different data sources in order to answer what should be a pretty simple question. So what we're working on right now is a query language that can sort of query all of these artifacts in a transparent way. So you don't need to worry about, is this data frame actually materialized somewhere? Is the model being stored in the format that Spark can read in, and so on. So that's something that we're pushing on pretty hard. It's not currently in the repo, but it should be in like a couple of months. There are two other directions that are interesting once we have ModelDB in place. The first one is mining data in ModelDB. So we have all this data that says a particular feature has, a particular model has these features, parameters, metrics. We really should be able to learn from that. So we should be able to say that these features work, these parameters work. So given the model history, can we suggest things that a data scientist might want to try? And this goes into like Bayesian modeling or AutoML and those sorts of techniques. And there's actually a lot of promise in being able to do this. We also want to do sort of full lifecycle management. Right now, we're very much focused on you build the model, and that's it. But like Dan mentioned before me, and as all of you know, the performance of models might change. You might have new data, there might be concept drift, and so on. So once you have a central repository for models, you can think about how to retrain them, or can you store some intermediates so that you can do this retraining faster, and so on. So that's ModelDB. Let me show you the repo and the website next. It's at modeldb.csel.mit.edu. This is what you'll see. This walks you through a high-level overview of how to use ModelDB, a little bit about the front end, architecture. And there's a short paper that I think a few people here have read and found interesting. So that's the repo. We have pretty good getting started guides, both for spark.ml and scikit-learn. This is the spark.ml one. You need to go through a few, install these dependencies, and I will say that be very careful with the thrift dependency because it will be painful. But once you get through that, incorporating ModelDB into an ML workflow is pretty straightforward. And we're more than happy to help you with installation issues, or we can't figure out how to do X. We're happy to do that. So jumping back here. Actually, why don't we see if the other thing has finished? It turns out that the run that we started has in fact finished. So if we go back here, there is a weird dot here. So we actually did better than the last time with our new features. And you can imagine how this graph would fill up as you do more runs. All right. So in closing, ModelDB is available now. Download it, try it out. Fair warning that it is research code. So while the people working with us have been able to deal with it, just note that we're happy to help you work around that and sort of be tech support in some sense. Tell us what you think. Tell us what we can do better. This is under the MIT license, so you can do whatever you want with it. And the great thing about being open source is you can contribute back if there is something that your organization or team would really benefit from and you think it's of interest to the community. We would love to see pull requests, patches, even documentation, whatever way you would like to engage with it. So that's it. And I'm happy to take any questions. You can reach out to me at that address or on Twitter, and that's the website. Thanks very much.
So we've got a good amount of time for questions here. So I'm going to kind of do it in the order I just saw hands.
Any plans to add additional machine learning libraries beyond scikit-learn and Spark?
Yeah, so a bunch of our users have asked about R, and that's something that we're exploring. It also depends on if enough people in the open source community are excited about it, then I think we would love to get help around that, because as a research outfit, it's kind of hard to do that. But yeah, we're hoping to have something for R.
Related to that, do you support PMML offline models?
No, we don't. And PMML has been something that we've gone back and forth on. We kind of thought that it would become the gold standard, and it didn't. So we kind of backed off from that. So we'll see if there is actually a standard that we should try conforming to.
Excellent. I saw a hand over here briefly. There we go. And then we're going to go here, and then here, and here.
First, thank you. It's a dumb question. We've been working with Spark for a while, and when I first jumped in, I was like, okay, there's a lot of data. We're a big company. What's been done with this data? So our data isn't clean, no one's is. So the flip side of what's been done with this data is also huge when someone says, oh, I want that data, but they don't. They want the better version of that data and what's been added. And yeah, can you comment?
Yeah. So data versioning is a really interesting topic and sort of a research topic in and of itself. Our lab has had this system called Data Hub, which was sort of geared towards doing that, where we were tracking versions of data sets and so on. We're not addressing that with ModelDB. Our solution is sort of, when you read the data in, we know where it came from. And one of the things we're adding is if you decide to write the data out, then we can also track where you wrote it. So currently we track where the model lives, but that's something that a few people have asked us, can you also track where the data was written out? So absolutely, yeah, thanks.
Hi.
Hi.
Do you have plans to support TensorFrame or Keras?
So we haven't looked at deep learning architectures as of now. So we don't. Oh. We haven't tried to interface this with TensorFlow. Do you say Keras and something?
Keras, yes.
Yeah, so we haven't tried to do anything with TensorFlow, Keras, and that ecosystem. The best we can do at this point is we have a light version of the API where you say, this was the data source, this is the model, and these were the parameters, but we cannot regenerate any of the pipelines. So that's like, unless Keras is instrumented by someone else, we can't really take advantage of that.
And one more, how do you compare it to other products out there like Domino Data Science Server?
So as far as what we've seen and talking to the companies who have reached out to us, people don't seem to be using those products a lot. So I'm sure that there are similarities. Someone at an ML conference said that this was done 20 years ago. But I think the fact is that no one's using it, so there's still a need. And I'm sure there will be similarities to things out there.
We saw a lot of how you store the metadata of the models. Do you actually store the physical model in some way? If yes, how do you deal with very big models? If no, how you would like to do that in the future?
Yeah, so right now we're letting Spark or Scikit-learn do the storage, and we're just keeping track of where you're storing it. But for the unified querying, it is something that we're looking at, and we're limiting ourselves to GLMs and ensembles, so forests. So for those, we have schemes that we think can compress the data well, because you're training a lot of models that are very similar. We can actually take advantage of similar numbers and do sort of floating point compression. So that's what we're looking at right now.
One more question. How do you map an ensemble of models in your database?
How do we, how do we represent, or?
You said, yeah, how do you represent an ensemble of models?
So right now, it works when the ensemble is packaged into something like a GBDT or a random forest. We're not supporting the ability to make ensembles yourself.
Very interesting work.
Thanks.
So my question is, for example, if I do a parameter search using a grid search, do you how do you handle that? Or if I do a cross-validation, do you actually store every result?
So that's a really good point. So for a parameter search, what you're going to do is you're going to create a parameter grid, and then you're going to say fit this cross-validation thing on there. So you still call a fit call. So you can call it with fit sync, and that's going to store the best model that cross-validation found. We have an option where you can store every model that was generated, which is why that thing had 500 that I showed. But it turns out that it takes a long time to log that to ModelDB. So by default, it's going to be off, so it doesn't store it. But if you actually want to track all of them, then you can set that to true, and then that'll do that. Yeah.
Does it store the versions of the libraries that created the models? Because sometimes when there's like a release, it's not backwards compatible, so you can't load the model if you update?
Yeah, right now, no. The way to do it would be to use the Lite API or use annotations to say this was built with Scikit-learn 0.17 because it's not compatible with 0.18. So annotations are currently the best way to do it.
Just to follow on, how about source control systems which have specific versions for models themselves?
Yeah. Oh, wait. So why aren't we using Git
No,
or?
I mean, if an enterprise has a source control system which actually has people checked in, for specific versions of the code, they're using that for running these models. Does it map for those specific versions or not?
Right. Let me tell you what we have support for, and maybe that answers your question. So one thing that I didn't demo, but is available, is we can snapshot your code. It is a slightly different code path than I demonstrated here. So you can say ModelDB followed by Python, whatever, my script. And what that will do is it will snapshot the directory that you said contained your code and associate the commit hash with that experiment run. So that's sort of, you can get back the code in that way. We decided not to use Git as our primary storage system because Git sort of treats all code equally, whereas there are some special things that we care about, the data sources, the hyperparameters, and so on. So the users are totally welcome to use Git to store whatever, and then we would just store a pointer to that location.
So we have time for one last question here. Here we go.
What database are you using on the back end, and how big can it get?
Right now, it's SQLite because it's easy to install. But all of this is SQL commands and SQL DDL statements. So you could plug in anything you wanted that supported SQL. So Hive or Postgres or whatever you want. Cool.
Thank you very much, Manasi. That was excellent talk. We're going to take a 30-minute break here, and please thank Manasi.
Thanks.